We were undecorating for Christmas, and now we've moved through Epiphany. We talked about what Epiphany means, that time when the presence of God in Jesus continues to grow. And now we get to settle in for that time of our journey with Jesus to the cross. Last Sunday in Epiphany is always Transfiguration, because this Transfiguration story is a hinge story. It doesn't come at the climax of the story. The Transfiguration story is in the middle, because the climax is on a different mountain and involves a different story. The one where, Jesus is executed for loving too much, for forgiving too much, for challenging the status quo too much. The Mount of Transfiguration story is a story, but it is the end of the Epiphany, beginning of Lent story. It's a hinge. So remember, we stood outside the manger in Bethlehem, observing the strange visitors, the shepherds, hearing songs from the angels in the sky, watching as the Magi arrived. Glorious, mysterious, wondrous. Today, we stand observing Jesus' face shining with radiance like a Christmas star. This cloud that descended, these two visitors, a voice that speaks from the midst of the cloud. It's a glorious, mysterious, wondrous story. Notice the symmetry, the parallels, two different stories. You know, Gary and I often rehash the sermon over coffee after church, and almost every Sunday he complains that the Bible is just too cryptic. It's too out there. You just can't really get these stories. And then he admits that, well, maybe it's his fundamentalist upbringing that has jaded him, because he was told clearly what those stories mean. And so when I suggest that they don't mean what he thought they meant, he's always a little confused. Here's what I need to say today. Religious practice, spiritual journey is, of course, an adventure in myth. Because to this point in human evolution, despite the great work they're doing on consciousness studies, there is, in fact, around faith issues, not one verifiable fact. We can't point and say, there's God. We can't do an autopsy on a recently deceased person and say, here is where the spirit left the body. But just because we do not have fact does not mean that what we believe and the faith that we practice is untrue. All cultures have their religious myths, the stories that frame life with meaning. And the Transfiguration is one of our great Christian stories that help provide meaning. Whether it literally happened, that Jesus' face was shining, that there was a spirit, a demon in the child, the literalness of the story is not the point. The point is the truth of the story. Incomprehensible things happened in the presence of Peter, James, and John on that mountain. Just like incomprehensible things happened in the stable in Bethlehem, in the star over the stable. Just like incomprehensible things happened in a graveyard on the first Easter. Incomprehensible to the brain, but deep inside, do not these stories capture the imagination and send our souls into flight? Well, if you've worshiped in the church for a long time, every Sunday before Ash Wednesday, you have heard the Transfiguration story. And you, of course, have heard the obvious meaning of it. When one has an experience of a spiritual high, don't we all want to hold on to it? The disciples wanted to build booths, one for Elijah, one for Moses, one for Jesus, and they could hang out up there and, just revel I'm sure if you've been there, heard the interpretation that, of course, we are not supposed to stay on the spiritual high, but to come down the mountain and live out our lives where the pain and struggle and suffering is. But here's what I discovered this year that I want to share with you. Watch the disciples and listen and watch Jesus. Because on the mountain, Peter's turned into kind of a babbling fool. Scripture says he didn't know what he was saying. And you know, can you blame him? Mysterious happenings mess with our heads. When we have something that we don't know what to do with, we, of course, don't know what to say about it. After these appearance of these revered figures, Moses, the greatest figure in Hebrew scripture, and Elijah, one of the most famous of the priests, Peter wants to do something. Build tabernacles, build shelters, build shrines. And isn't it in our human nature that we want to do something? Because doing nothing, simply sitting still in silence, is a hard thing for us humans to do. So that's what's going on with the disciples up there. And then once we come down the mountain, Luke carefully ties this story with Jesus healing the boy of convulsions. And Scripture's very clear to say that that's something the disciples couldn't do. The disciples